All right, if you've got your notes, tonight we're going to talk about Exodus 13 and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But I want to talk a little bit about the importance of Israel's calendar and Israel's festivities. Now, if you're like me, a lot of times I get caught up in a lot of things theologically in the Bible. Tonight's not necessarily going to be a big theological dealing type lesson. It's going to be like a background learning lesson. And that's what I've got in your notes. I think sometimes we need to just stop and look at the culture that the Bible was written in. Because if we understand the culture that it was written in, then we'll understand a lot more that was going on. And specifically here in the Old Testament, in the agricultural region that we are in, you and I should be able to understand as much as anybody in America the culture and setting of the Bible. Israel was agricultural. They were huge in what we would call a farming industry, harvest, grain. The Bible is littered with harvest and grain imagery. It is everywhere. The Bible's going to use this festival, feast day stuff and play on it with a spiritual application. So the first thing I want to do, to be honest, and I know this is kind of boring, but I'm really just going to read these notes to start this out and then go back to Exodus 12 and 13, and we'll talk about it from there. Is that okay with everybody? So if y'all get bored, just fall asleep, and we'll have somebody wake you up. All right, here we go. Israel was largely agricultural. People would eventually know them for production of crops. And when I say people, I mean the surrounding nations that are around them. Everybody would look at them and know this is what they do. Remember, when God promised them Canaan, He said, "Behold, I'm giving you a land flowing with" what? So the picture is that Canaan is going to be just like Eden in the sense that it's bountiful, it's blessed, and God's going to give the increase of everything that they'll have. Not that other nations didn't farm, they did, but Israel was centered around it. And you might remember last time we taught this, that was 2 weeks ago, in Exodus 12, that God changed the calendar for Israel whenever He pulled them out of Egypt. So this is a complete restart. And one thing I want you to do, I want you to take your... I got it. That was Dirt Pen Depot. Okay, one thing I want you to do, I want you to take your pen, and at the top of your page, I want you to write NHNE. Because what God is doing essentially here, when He pulls them out, He's taking and calling them His people and making a new heaven and a new earth. That's the picture of what He's doing here and playing along those lines. Okay, back to the notes. Israel was centered around it. You wouldn't find them as mass producers of other raw materials. In fact, they would turn to other nations for certain things, such as Solomon turning to Tyre and Sidon while constructing the temple. Y'all remember that story? Solomon's trying to gather all the things, and David and Solomon, they wind up making this treaty with the nations near them, and they send them all these raw materials, the gold and all the other things that they had to have coming in to construct the temple. Well, what did they get in return? Well, they would trade them the grain and some of the produce that they had. So that's where we go on that. Paragraph 2. Like our culture, they naturally gathered around food. I really do think it's a biblical thing. I mean, we gather around food because, number one, it's enjoyable. Number two, you've got to have it to sustain life. And number three, we like to eat. I mean, that's kind of what it is. Right, and the fellowship that comes along every time you eat. And they had that. And I think that fellowship was really important to them as far as the family goes. Okay? I read somewhere this week, and I put it in here. Well, it's in the very next part in this paragraph. Here you go, skip reading. That's why I said read it. The goal was to have the family gathered together once a day around a meal. This would keep the peace among the family. Now, you think about that. If your family sat down around a meal, think about all your cousins that you don't like. If y'all were forced every day to sit down around a meal, do you think y'all could probably work some things out that you can't do because you don't see them but about 2 or 3 times a year? Christmas and Easter, and let's be honest, after Grandma dies, you're not going to get together with them anymore for Christmas and Easter. True. Mine's coming for me too. Okay, anyway. Okay, this would keep the peace among the family, and if someone refused to come, then you knew something was up. There was a problem. Something was wrong. God would construct Israel's calendar around the harvest time and the meal time. Knowing the details of this will help us understand the Bible, so we will take some notes about their climate and how their world functioned. First order, is that we need to establish that there were two growing seasons in their culture. Two growing seasons. You got a wet season and a dry season. Winter into spring is the wet season, and that's where you would get all of your heavy rains that are going to come, allow you to disc up the ground and till it. You farmers understand that better than I do. But for them, this was the winter into the spring. That's their wet season. While the summer into the fall was the dry season. And normally what you would have is a period of 4-month dry spell. So about May, June, July, August, you've got the 4 dry months just kicking in a row. And depending on what you get out of September, kind of get a little bit of a hard time there. So, winter into spring is the wet season. Summer into fall is the dry. This naturally provides multiple harvest times and multiple types of crops. By God's providence, He placed Israel, them, near the Mediterranean Sea, which would send clouds for rain coming from the northwest. So, issues over there, sprouting up the clouds, bringing them rain in. Let's look over at Deuteronomy chapter 11. Flip there with me, and we'll see a little bit about these. So, these are what we know as the former rain or the early rain. So, when we say former rain or early rain, we're talking about the winter to the spring months that provide us this wet season rain. Deuteronomy chapter 11. Somebody read it when you get there. 11:14. All right, I got it. God says, look at verse 13, 11:13. And it shall be that if you earnestly obey my commandments, which I command you today, to love the Lord your God, and to serve Him with all your heart and with all your soul, then I will give you the rain for your land in its season, the early rain and the latter rain, that you may gather in your grain, your new wine, and your oil. And one thing that I always had an issue with, and y'all forgive me for my ignorance, because I've taught about Pentecost and a lot of stuff. You know, at Pentecost, you're always going to bring in the first fruit of the harvest, right? So you're bringing in the first fruit of the harvest, and I'm like, well, where'd they get that at? Because think about mining your agricultural stuff. You don't have a harvest that's happening in April, do you? Not like they did on that stuff. But when you have these two separate seasons, from the winter to the spring, and you've got that wet season, that early rain, then you've got a crop at that time that they can bring some of that into, and then you'll have another harvest later on in the year that'll help you out. But it says here, verse 14, they have to keep the commandment, they've got to keep the covenant in order for God to provide the rain. Now, just like in our day, if there's not any food, what's everybody going to do? Yeah, they're going to starve. So that's why famine's always such a big deal in the Bible. You remember the story of Elijah when he goes up on Mount Carmel and he prays to God, and God, maybe he didn't go up on Carmel first, but Elijah prays to God. What did he ask for? Lord, seal up the heavens. Why did Elijah pray for God to seal up and not let there be any rain? Because the people were not obeying the covenant. They weren't following the Lord. They were in sin. So God seals it up for that time period. Was it 7 years or was it 3.5 years? I don't remember. 3.5, and then there's another 3.5 years of plenty. Okay, so Deuteronomy 11, we see this picture. It's centered around all of this agricultural stuff. Back to our notes. I'm in the indention paragraph, when the temperature. When the temperature rises in the spring, the rain tapers off. The rain in the spring and summer is called the latter rain, or the late rain, and provides ripeness to the wheat and the barley that would be harvested. Once we understand the story of redemption and how feast days of Israel are used in it, we can then go back into the Bible stories, especially the Old Testament, and see how they help us to understand what is going on. All throughout the Bible, we are given references of agricultural times when Bible characters do certain things. And let me give you a couple examples of this. This is so good. All right, think with me on a practical level right quick. You're going to have every year these appointed harvest times. And around these appointed harvest times, you've got Israel's festive calendar. Everybody good with that? This festive calendar in the New Testament points toward a spiritual application of redemption. Everybody got that? I'll give you an example. Paul says that Christ is our Passover lamb in 1 Corinthians. Right with me? Paul also says that Christ is the first fruits. Does that make sense? So you're going to have a spiritual application. But one thing I noticed, it's probably been a year and a half ago, we were going through the book of Ruth, and I got through the book of Ruth and I realized something. I thought, you dummy, is it not wild the timing of when Ruth meets Boaz and when Ruth marries Boaz? You with me? I want you to see a little bit of this. Turn to Ruth chapter 1 right quick. Ruth chapter 1. When somebody figures out what page Ruth's on, tell me so I can find it. 463, okay, I'm there. All right, look at Ruth 1:22. Ruth 1:22 says, "So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem when?" All right, now why does the Bible tell us that? Why does the Bible tell us when Ruth and Naomi came and returned? Well, and why does it specifically tell us at the time of the harvest? What does that matter to the story? Well, you go back and you read the Old Testament, there's all kind of things that are happening at appointed feast times. They're everywhere. Here's the picture I think happens. Ruth is going to meet Boaz roughly about the time of Pentecost. With me? She's going to marry him later that fall when the final harvest is brought in at the Feast of Tabernacles. Everybody see a picture? When does the Holy Spirit come in the New Testament? There you go. There's your engagement period. And then you get your picture of a coming of Christ connected to the Feast of Tabernacles. That's when the wedding happens. See the picture? Is that not beautiful? And God laced that all the way through the Bible story, and I never noticed it. But thinking about this week, or really when we got done with Ruth, I thought, well, I can't go back and re-preach the whole deal now, but whatever. It's close enough. So just those ideas. Give me another example here. Look with me at Amos chapter 7. Amos chapter 7, verse 1. We'll just look at a few more. Amos should be a little harder for you to find. I'm almost convinced if you did a study on this, you would be able to follow this all the way out and find that God had appointed certain things in Israel, like judgments and all these others, at harvest times, and there's going to be a pattern that's there. I just haven't studied it far enough to see it yet. I did in Ruth, but not everywhere else. Okay, Amos 7:1. "Thus the Lord God showed me, behold, he formed locust swarms at the beginning of the late crop. Indeed, it was the late crop after the king's mowings." Well, when you get to the book of Revelation, you get this same locust reference, which is an army coming into judgment, and this all happens at the same time as the late crop. It's all amazing in how it works together. So, you can chase the rest of those references on your page, and I'll leave them alone, but I think this is really important to understand and would help us in our Bible study. Okay, at the bottom of our notes, it says this. As a reference, I will list below the month of Israel. September to October was what we know as the month of Tishri. October to November is Heshvan. Next came Kislev, Tevet, Shavat, Adar. March to April is Nisan. And Nisan is the month when we will see the Passover and unleavened bread. April to May was called Liar or Lair. Sivan was May to June. Tammuz, and Elul. So those are the months and kind of how they worked. Remember, they weren't working on a 365-day calendar. They were working on a 360-day calendar. Because the reference that I had started it there. So, no particular reason. When you read in, the reason that I did that and what I was studying, which I can get you a reference to the book. It's in my office. I didn't write it down. Paul wears his name, and they did a whole deal on it. The reason that he started it with September to October is because that's the beginning of this harvest season. Okay? So that's essentially when your when your early rain is going to begin during that time. The first month, according to God, for Israel, was which month? Does anybody know? The Passover and the unleavened bread happened in that. Yeah, Nisan. Nisan meaning first. So Nisan is technically their first one, their first month. And for me and you, that's about March 15th to mid-April. Okay? So, how that flows. Okay. Let's look at the last paragraph on your page there. It says this. Passover and unleavened bread would occur in the month of Nisan. This helps us to understand that the Exodus takes place in the spring. On the 10th of Nisan, they would take the Passover lamb. On the 14th, they would kill it. Unleavened bread would begin the next day and last for 7 days. And what I understand is that on the 7th day, there would be a fast. They were to cast all of the leaven out of the house. Now, take this next part with a grain of salt and you can study it. Many people claim leaven represented sin, and that's possible. The 1 Corinthians 5 reference down here is going to seem to indicate that. But I'm unsure because they were allowed to eat leavened bread every other month. So all the rest of the year, you can eat it. If that was the picture, then why were they allowed to eat it at all? Why would they be allowed to eat leaven at all if it represented sin? Everybody see the problem there? Like, that don't make a lot of sense to me. Maybe I just don't get it. Nevertheless, I could be wrong. Many would say that throwing the leaven out of the house is the same picture as Christ, who bore our sin, being buried into the ground. Okay? Jesus is the Passover lamb. He's the fulfillment of unleavened bread. He's the first fruits that rises from the dead. 50 days after Jesus rises from the dead, what happens? Pentecost, Acts chapter 2. You with me? Here's how it happens in the first Exodus. Moses and them put the blood on the Passover door. They eat they throw out the unleavened. They eat the unleavened bread. Throw out the leaven. The first fruits, I believe, is the day that they cross the Red Sea. Okay? 50 days after they cross the Red Sea, Moses gets the law on Mount Sinai on stone tablets. Everybody see the pictures? Everybody got that? That's good. I wish I would have learned that when I was about 6, and I could have been a lot further along in my Bible study. All right, let's keep going. In my mind, these two feasts are intertwined. The purpose was to remember that God had passed over the firstborn in every house who had the blood applied and led them out of Egypt. Other important notes are that, one, the whole assembly of Israel participated. So you had certain things that only the men would do, but everyone was to participate in this act. Number two, they did it in family groups. This is family worship, I believe, in the midst of Israel. Number three, they ate the roasted lamb, unleavened bread, and bitter herbs, and nothing could come out of there. Okay? Everybody with me so far? We good? All right, let's do this. I want to go back to the end of Exodus 12, and let's work our way through Exodus 12 and through Exodus 13, and you can see some of this. So this isn't just a group of people leaving a place. This is God establishing His covenant with the people. Now, think about it this way. Adam is in the garden. He's in the presence of God. Adam is the covenant man in the presence of God. And what condition does God give him? He says, Adam, of every tree in the garden you can surely eat, but you can't eat of this one certain tree. With me? If you break this covenant, then you get kicked out of the garden. What's Adam do? He breaks the covenant, therefore gets kicked out of the garden. Israel, I'm going to put you back in the presence of God in the land of Canaan, and 1 week out of the year, you're not going to eat this bread. If you eat this bread, then you break the covenant. And if you break the covenant, I'll kick you out of the land and send somebody. Does everybody see how it's the same story? Here's how this works. Adam and Israel give us the exact same picture. All right? Everything Adam fails, Israel's going to fail too. The difference in Adam and Israel is that Israel is given knowledge of the law. They have the law and see right and wrong. Jesus is the new Adam and the new Israel. And He's the better Adam and the better Israel and fulfills it all. That's the picture that the Bible presents us. Exodus 12:43. Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat it. So you got to be a covenant man if you're going to eat the Passover meal. Every man's servant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then he may eat it. He's got to come into the covenant. A sojourner and a hired servant shall not eat it. In one house it shall be eaten. You shall not carry any of the flesh where? All right, think about it. The sacrifice has to die. There has to be a death, and then when you pass through the doorway, that's the picture of a new birth. All right? Now, let me ask you a question. In the Passover in Exodus, did they murder their firstborn son? Yes or no? Was it the first son that was killed? Yes or no? No. They were trying to save their firstborn son, right? Well, what did they kill instead? A substitute lamb that was spotless and without blemish. Think about it this way. You had to go get this second one and bring him into the house and then kill it. Let's say it another way. Remember when Abraham takes Isaac on the mountain? Remember that part? Isaac's not an acceptable sacrifice because he's not spotless and without blemish. It has to be the second one that they find, and they find a spotless, unblemished ram caught in a thicket, and they kill it. Well, that's the same picture if you wanted to work that all the way through Esau and Jacob and the whole 9 yards. But essentially what you have is, it's not the first son that is the acceptable sacrifice. It's the second son. It's not Adam, it's Jesus. And that's the picture that the Bible gives to us. So every year in Passover, essentially what you have, the father is the priest who's in the home. You've got a burning that's going on in your house. Now, can you think of another place where there was a burning that went on where sacrifices were made? In the temple. The temple and the tabernacle every year. You're going to bring it in. They're going to sacrifice it. They're going to consume it with fire. What this is a picture of is that the man is a priest in his home, and he's to take care of it. Now, who is the man as a priest in his home? Who is he to take care of? Well, first off, you're to take care of your wife and your children. Amen? Okay, that's a picture, biblical picture of the man. But he was also to take care of his brother. It was the responsibility of the man who made the sacrifice to take care of his brother. Remember the story of Cain and Abel? Remember? Abel brings an acceptable sacrifice. Cain doesn't bring an acceptable sacrifice. And you've heard it. Well, Cain didn't bring the first fruit, and Cain wasn't willing like Abel was, and yada, yada, yada. Well, here's another part. Abel brought animals, and Cain brought fruit of the ground. And if you're going to come before the presence of God, you've got to bring a slaughtered, killed animal in order to do so. But do you remember the question that Cain asked God after he killed Abel? God said, Cain, your brother's blood cries to me from the ground. Cain looks at God and says, am I my what? And the answer is, yes, he should have been his brother's keeper in that sense. That's the same picture that we get at Passover. Christ, the better brother, dies for the sins of the people and covers it. He's the priest in the home. The same picture as Adam in the garden. Adam fails in the garden just as Cain fails. Now, Adam, when he sinned, what did God do to Adam when he sinned in the garden? He kicked him out. Remember after Cain killed Abel? What did God do to Abel? You remember? Sent him east. Just the same way that he sent Adam out of the garden, sent him out of his presence and got rid of him. The Bible is the same story over and over and over. When Israel sins, God's going to send a nation and drive them out. And he's always going to drive them out to the east, by the way. So, let's leave it there. I think I made my point. Exodus 12:48. When the stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then let him come near and keep it. He shall be as a native of the land, for no uncircumcised person shall eat it. One law shall be for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among you. Thus, all the children of Israel did as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. And it came to pass on that very same day that the Lord brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt according to their armies. And you should underline armies. Israel is pictured as a warrior nation that God is going to use. And I believe the church is the same way. Y'all remember that song? I hadn't sang it in a long time. I may never march with the infantry, ride in the cavalry, shoot the artillery. I may never zoom, but I'm in the Lord. That's the same picture as the church, just like Israel was. Brother Swan, you remember that song? Yes or no? All right, I expect you to sing it for a special Sunday morning. Chapter 13, verse 1. Y'all going to have to give me a second. I got to find a water. All right, go fish. We're good. Let's keep going. Somebody read in chapter 13:1 for us. Read that. Not everybody at once, please. I'll stop you in about 2 seconds. New King James Version. That's God's chosen translation. All right. I'm not going into this, but I'm just going to say it. We did this about 2 months ago. The blood applied to the doorpost is the same picture. The legs on a woman are pictured as the exact same thing as a doorpost. And when you pass through it, that's what's coming out of it. Okay? Go ahead. All right, let me ask a question. Does God have a hand, yes or no? All right, how can it say God brought him out with his strong hand? All right, Travis, what's an anthropomorphism?
That's where you use human faculties to describe a spirit being who is God.
Everybody got that? Can you spell anthropomorphism for us?
No.
All right, yeah, so like it's, yeah, God does it with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. God doesn't have a hand or an arm, but that helps us to understand exactly what God's talking about when he does that. It's through his power and his might that he's done it. Moses couldn't do it on his own. Aaron couldn't do it on his own. It's through God's work. Jordan, keep going. Okay. Number one, I messed this up in your notes. So go back in your notes on that final paragraph. And I said, on the seventh day there would be a fast. It's not a fast. It's the opposite of a fast. It's a feast. Okay? All right. Today I ate shrimp. I ate like a little really cheap steak. The other night, though, on Sunday night, we had a good steak, men, didn't we? Amen? It's normal for me and you to eat meat. It wasn't normal for them to eat meat. That was a big deal. What I was studying this week was saying that even the idea of them bringing an unblemished, like fatted, perfect animal for a sacrifice, that was a huge sacrifice to them financially in order to be able to do that. So we take it for granted, but a feast for them would have been a time where they got to eat meat and enjoy all the delicacies that, honestly, you and I can have just about every day. So keep going, Jordan.
You should tell your son in that day, saying, this is done because of what the Lord did to me when I came up from Egypt. It shall be as a sign to you in your hand, as a memorial between your eyes, and the Lord's law may be in your mouth. But with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt.
All right, let me make a couple notes right here. Tell your son in that day, and I think the Hebrew in this text tells us that the son that it's talking about there is the firstborn son. It's the responsibility to tell the firstborn son. Now, think about it again. Remember in the story of Joseph, whenever Joseph goes out and he's going to give a report on his brothers and it comes up missing. When Jacob has an encounter with the boys, who was responsible to give an account for what had happened to Joseph? Do you remember? Which son was it? Well, you don't have to tell me his name. Just tell me which one it was. The firstborn oldest son, Reuben. It was Reuben's job that he was going to give an account. He had the responsibility in order to do this. Well, eventually what happens is you get failure by the firstborn sons over and over, which is typical. So God winds up taking the tribe of Levites, and he puts them in charge of the priestly service and order in order to take care of the folks. Okay? So there's a picture of what happens. Let me make a couple other notes here. When it says, verse 8 again, you shall tell your son in that day, saying, this is done because of what the Lord did for me when I came from Egypt. This is a general recollection. We need to pass down from generation to generation what God has done for us. Is there a list in your family book or whatever you've got? Start you a family book. It says, here's when God saved me. Here's what God did for us on this date. Here are the mile markers. Whenever they get into the land, they're going to carry these big stones as memorials, and they're going to have them placed there. And every time they pass them memorials, they're going to say, this is what God did for us back then. And here's what he did. And my kids are going to know it for all generations. That's what you need to be having as a goal for your family. I ain't saying there's anything wrong with you passing down money. I hope everyone, if you make so much money, you can pass down millions of dollars that your grandkids can't spend. But you better make sure there's a spiritual inheritance about what God has done for you and your family lineage somewhere. And the good thing about it is, if there's not one coming from you, from dad or grandpa, you can start it right now. You can start it as grandma. You know, one thing that's crazy to me, I've been helping the football team, and, you know, kids these days, they just cuss in front of adults, and I'm always saying something to them about it. And one of them told me today, he's like, I'm 18 years old. I can do what I want. I said, listen, I'm 31 years old, and I don't do what I want. You know why? Because I have a king whose name is Jesus that says I don't talk this way. Here's the problem with that. I'll never be able to have the influence over that kid to make him be able to change his patterns of life. But there's somebody in his life that could, and it's a daddy, or it's even a grandma. I mean, you better believe it, kids listen to grandma and grandpa, and you better believe they listen to mom and dad. God has set it up so that the main influence is mom and dad and those who are immediate in the family. And that's just the truth of it. Somebody wants to get your attention, it's probably going to be somebody pretty close to you. So we need to pass those things down. All right, the second thing in verse 9 here says this. It shall be as a sign to you on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes. Let me ask a question. Did the Israelites and the Jews literally walk around with something on their hand and on their head, yes or no? It should be so obvious that you're my people. This should be the evidence of it in the way that you live. What do you do with your hands? It's not a trick question. He's in the Lord's army. He fights with his hands. So let's say it this way. We work with our hands. What do we do with our heads? We think. Everything that we think about and all the work of our hands should be for the Lord and should make a proclamation of who He is. Everybody with me on that? So if I was to say take a mark of the beast, what would that mean? Who would I be thinking like? I wouldn't be worshiping Yahweh, but I'd be worshiping Satan or somebody else. I'd be working for somebody else other than God. So note that. Verse 10. You shall therefore keep this ordinance in its season from year to year. Verse 11. It shall be when the Lord brings you into the land of Canaanites, as He swore to you and your fathers, and gives it to you, that you shall set apart to the Lord all that open the womb, that's the firstborn son, every firstborn that comes from an animal which you have, the males shall be the Lord's. Now this is the picture. When God in the Passover, the 10th plague in Egypt, who did He kill of the Egyptians? The firstborn what? Why? Because Israel, according to Hosea 11, was God's firstborn son. Pharaoh wouldn't let his son go, so God, Yahweh, in return, killed all of Egypt's firstborn sons. And now God's calling His nation out and saying, listen, I didn't kill your kids because you had the Passover lamb, but all your boys, they're mine. You're mine. I own you. You submit to me, I'll be your Lord and I'll take care of you. It's a good picture. You say, Zach, we really want to say that we worship or that we're owned by somebody? Friends, there ain't nothing better. I can tell you that I'm owned by Jesus Christ and I'm His. No shame of that. Verse 13. Every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. And if you will not redeem it, then you shall break its neck. And I wish I had something really good theologically to tell you about this. When I was studying, I was thinking, this has got to be something really good. I'm fixing to blow their mind. I didn't find it. I don't know. Here's all I came up with. A donkey's unclean, okay? So a lamb has to redeem what's unclean. If you don't redeem it, then it dies. You break its neck. That's all I got. Donkeys were very, very valuable. Very valuable. I have nothing else and nothing more to tell you on that. I'm sorry. I have failed you as a pastor. Verse 14. I thought I had a good opportunity too there, and it didn't work out. So it shall be, when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what is this? That you shall say to him, by strength of hand of the Lord brought us out of Egypt, and out of the house of bondage. I was sitting in the van, it was yesterday, and Ty said something, I don't know if he said, Ty's my 2-year-old, he said crap or something like that. And I said, Ty, we don't say that. And he's at the age, and he says this 3-letter word all the time. He said, why? Why? Why don't we say it? And Hudson, from the back seat in the back of the van, says, because Jesus is our king, and he says we don't talk like that. And he's 5. That's the picture. That's what we're trying to do. You know what I mean? That's literally what the 5-year-old said. I'm like, this is what we got to know. This is what we're doing here. As complicated as we want to make anything in the world, this is what we're doing. Verse 15. It came to pass, when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go, that the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beasts. Therefore, I sacrifice to the Lord all males that open the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. It shall be as a sign on your hand and as frontlets between your eyes, for by strength of the hand of the Lord has brought us out of Egypt. Then it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines. Now, think about, what were they doing in Egypt? What were the Hebrews' jobs in Egypt? What were they? Starts with an S, ends with a laves. Say it again? Yes, yeah, they were serving the straw, they were slaves. Did they have time to sit there and practice military tactics every day? No, they're worried about surviving. They're trying to get out of there. They don't know what's coming next. So this part is really interesting in verse 17. God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. They weren't ready for it yet. So God led the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. And the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had placed the children of Israel under solemn oath, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here with you. I'm going to be honest, that's impressive. People tell me things all the time right before I get up to preach. Hey, Zach, make this announcement, do this, yada, yada, yada. My mind's on something else. I'm busy. I forget it all the time. For Moses and them to remember, all the way back to the end of Genesis 49 and 50, when they buried Joseph, and Joseph said, hey, when God comes and visits you guys and leads you out of this place a couple hundred years later, get my bones and take them and bury them in the land of Canaan, if you don't mind, please. That's pretty good. I wouldn't have remembered. I'd have forgot it. And then somebody would let me know about it. I'd have got a text after church and said, if I was Moses, I'd have got all the way into Canaan and had my tent built, and somebody sent me a text and said, we're going to have to go back and get Joseph's bones, see what the issue is. Verse 20. So they took their journey from Succoth and camped in Etham in the edge of the wilderness, and the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and by night. Now I want you to note this. The cloud and the fire are the presence of God with His people. Let me say it another way. That's the way that God tabernacled among His people. Let me say it again. God dwelt among the people. He didn't dwell in the people. Everybody got it? Whenever they build the tabernacle, especially the temple in Jerusalem, they bring the offering in, they have this big festival, Solomon does this deal, and then God's presence comes and consumes something in the temple, and guess how He consumed it? Through what? Fire. Acts chapter 2. It doesn't say that fire came, but it said that the Holy Spirit fell as or like what? That's how they knew the presence of God was with them in the New Covenant, just like God was with them in the Old Covenant. That's a straight Exodus theme, good motif. Everybody got that? Take note. Teach that to your kids too. All right, verse 21. The Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night from before the people. And that leads us to the Red Sea crossing, which we'll take up in 2 weeks. Everybody with me? That probably wasn't the most exciting thing you've ever heard in your life, but friends, we're learning the story of redemption here, and I think it's beautiful. Travis, you want to pray for us?